So what does the 100th Bomb Group, General Patton, and this small Bavarian town have in common? Don't know? We'll stick around and find out. Hi, I'm John, and welcome to my channel, World War II Wayfinder. Now, if you're enjoying my content and travels around Europe, finding new and interesting World War II locations, as well as some already fairly well covered ones, I'd love it if you subscribe to the channel and leave a comment down below on what your favourite European location is to travel to that's got a connection with the Second World War. Now, today I am in the old part of the town of Moosburg in Bavaria. Now, interestingly, the town dates back to the 12th century, and between Regensburg and Italy, this is the oldest town from there, even through Austria, which I think is quite cool. But on the 29th of April 1945, this town would become quite notorious, and that was all thanks to the fact that this was the location of Stalag VIIa. Right, I'm now in the village of Mauren, which is it's between 6 and 8 kilometers from Moosburg itself. And it was here on the 28th of April 1945 that the 14th Armoured Division and its lead elements, most notably the 47th Tank Regiment, arrived here in the evening, and they put out a defensive perimeter around the south side of the village in the direction of Moosburg, knowing that the next morning their objective was to attack Moosburg and to secure the crossing over the Isar River on the southeasterly side of the town to enable them to continue their push southward into Bavaria up to the Austrian border. The village here itself has changed significantly since the war years. However, what is still remaining is the church right in the centre of the village, and it would have been in this location in and around this area that the command post would have been established for the 47th Tank Regiment. So from this point here in Mauren, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to jump in the car and I'm going to follow the road from here down to Moosburg and to the Amperbrücke, or the Amper Bridge. And this was the location of the main battle for Moosburg between the American 14th Armoured and elements of the 38th SS Grenadier Division. So, let's go. Right, so I've just driven from Mauren in the north behind me down toward Moosburg, and I'm just about to cross the Amper River. Now, if this was the 29th of April 1945, this would have been the main defensive positions of the 38th SS Grenadier Division. Now, interestingly, the 38th SS was a kind of composite scratch division formed in April 1945 and very early April 1945. They were made up of previous SS divisions that had been reduced in strength through the fighting, and they kind of formed the core. And then they also used recruits from the Junkerschule, or officers' school, in Bad Tölz, which is further south beyond Munich toward the Austrian border. And interestingly of note, a famous actor was a member of the 38th SS. That was Hardy Kruger. Now, in this area that I'm walking, and we're going over the Amper Bridge as we speak, this river provided a great defensive barrier for the German forces in this area, and this was exactly what they were going to use to stop the American forces from gaining entry, or at least delaying them from gaining entry into the town of Moosburg. So on the embankments behind me, both to the left and right of the bridge, that was where the 3rd Battalion of the 96th Regiment of the 38th SS prepared to dig in. Now, in terms of these troops' ability to defend against a US armoured division in 1945, it was quite pathetic. They had small arms, so K98 rifles, submachine guns, possibly a smattering of STG-44s, the new assault rifle. They had Panzerfaust, Panzerschrecks, but they didn't have any heavy weapon support. They didn't have any armour support. Clearly no Luftwaffe support to talk about at this time in the war, because they've been decimated thanks to the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Force. So the ability for them to hold on to this position here was somewhat limited, to say the least. But they did decide to dig in here and form a defensive line. Now, ironically, the one thing that most people will probably understand that's watching this, that if you've got a water obstacle to cross, the last thing you want to do is give the enemy a means with which to cross it. And that bridge right there, albeit that's a post-war one, the original wartime one wasn't destroyed by the Germans. They decided to leave it up because it carried an electrical supply cable to and from Moosburg, and they deemed that keeping that intact was quite important for the civilian population, which I just find incredible given their desire to continue to stem the tide of the American advance. But from these positions, this was where the SS were going to put up their fight. Now, early morning on the 29th of April, the American forces, the 47th Armoured Regiment, in the lead with elements of the 68th Infantry Regiment, moved south from Mauron along the road. They had M4 Shermans and M8 armoured cars on either side as flank protection for the infantry, and they moved south down toward this position. They knew from reconnaissance that this was the ideal crossing point, and they also knew to expect a firefight here with the Germans. At 0900, the first troops started to enter the area, and they came under fire from the Germans. Now, one thing the Americans had decided not to do in this instance was to put in a preparatory artillery barrage, because they were concerned of any rounds going long and landing in the POW camp, which is in that general direction over there. So they were very concerned about that. But as the Americans got to these positions here, and there were also Germans dug in on that tree line there, that's actually the railway embankment, and you'll be able to see from the aerial footage just how close that is to this location. So they were dug in there, and when they met resistance, some of the Shermans and M8s, they ended up going to a village called Feldkirchen, which is in that general direction. And you have to imagine that in 1945, a lot of this greenery wasn't here. This is all quite a mature area now, but back then, I think a lot of it was just very open farm and open farmland, open plains. And they had a clear line of sight, and they were able to pour fire on from their 75mm guns and take out the German positions there and provide that close-in fire support that the infantry needed as the attack was pushed in. So, by about 10:30, the battle in this area was over. The 3rd Battalion of the 96th Regiment of the 38th SS, those who hadn't surrendered, were lying dead in the fields around here. The firefight was an intense one. The Americans did suffer casualties, however. It was over rapidly, and they were able to then continue with their objective, which was to gain that crossing over the Isar River. And we will now go and take a look at that bridge and the story that happened there. Right, so continuing the story of Moosburg, its liberation, and the fight that occurred here. So where I'm stood now is the main bridge from the town that crosses the Isar River. As you can see, it's quite a wide river. and pretty fast flowing as well. And what's important about this location was this was the objective for, or the main objective for the 14th Armoured Division, was to reach this point on the 29th of April, take their tanks over it onto the southern bank, and then continue to pursue the remnants of the German forces that were in this area that were continuing to head south. So after their firefight on the north side of the town, the Shermans from the 47th Tank Regiment made it to this location at around 11 on the morning of the 29th. And you can see just above my shoulder there the on-ramp for the bridge. Now, 11 as the first Sherman entered that on-ramp, the Germans from their positions on the southern bank over there could see what was about to happen, and they detonated the charges that were strapped to the bridge, and they blew it into the Isar River. Now, the bridge itself wasn't totally destroyed. It was still traversable on foot, so US troops were able to move across the bridge and get onto the southern bank, but it couldn't take any armoured vehicles whatsoever. So after that occurred, the effort switched somewhat. The Americans knew they couldn't pursue the Germans further south onto the southern bank of the Isar for the time being, so instead they turned their attentions to the POWs at STALAG VIIA, back on the northeast side of the town. But the events now that did occur here was the combat engineers from the division were called in, and it was their job to break through the berm that's used as a flood defence for the river here, and to start laying a pontoon bridge down so that armoured vehicles and the rest of the division could continue their move further south. So aside from the Isar Bridge being destroyed here and the 14th Armoured having to cross on a pontoon bridge to reach the southern bank of the Isar, one notable event did occur here on the 1st of May 1945. General George S. Patton visited this very location behind me, and the building that you can see there is now a guest house, and I believe it was still that during 1945, although they have since added a third floor and the roof has increased in size. But the basic shape and layout of the building and the roads surrounding it can still be seen from the original photos and aerial reconnaissance photos from that time. And whilst he was inspecting here, he noticed a Sherman from the 14th Armoured that was about to cross the pontoon bridge to make it to the southern bank, and the Sherman itself was covered in sandbags over the front plate. Now, clearly this was done by the tank crews in an effort to protect themselves from the threat of Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks that the Germans still had plentiful supplies of at this stage during the war. However, Patton didn't see it like that. All he could see was additional weight on the tank would mean an increase in fuel usage, and as we all know, logistics win wars, and Patton was all about speed and aggression. He didn't like anybody who took a cautious approach to battle. For him, aggressive, assertive action was his thing all the way through. And there is film footage of him storming away from this tank crew, and the rumour has it that he chewed them out for their actions of trying to protect themselves, especially when you considered the war really only had another week to run at this point, although clearly they didn't know when the exact surrender would be called. I'll put the link in the description below to where you can find that footage, and you can judge for yourself, but from my perspective, Patton certainly looks pretty upset as he's storming away from the tank toward the camera. Right, so now I am at the main point of interest here in Moosburg, and that is the site of the former Stammlager 7A, or Stalag 7A for short. Now, the Stalags, if you've seen The Great Escape, you'll know that that's Stalag Luft 3, and that was a POW camp under the charge of the Luftwaffe predominantly, whereas Stalag 7A here in Moosburg was under the command of the Wehrmacht, and Oberst Berger, or Colonel Berger, was the camp commandant here. Now, originally, the site was constructed in 1939, and it first started housing prisoners in October 1939. Throughout its kind of 5.5-year lifespan here, there were more than 150,000 prisoners registered here. Now, not all at one time, obviously that number did grow, but it was only originally designed to house 10,000. Now, bearing in mind the population, civilian population of the town of Moosburg itself during the war was around 7,000. Did fluctuate a little bit, of course, but predominantly around 7,000. By war's end, there are some reports that claim that over 115,000 POWs were located here. The problem with those numbers is they can't really be substantiated, because clearly at the end of the war, the German record keeping system, as efficient as we like to think the Germans are with paperwork, by that stage even they weren't able to keep up with it. Not to mention the prison camp here did house Russian prisoners as well, and they were clearly treated in a very different manner to those Allied prisoners of war, which is something that needs to be remembered as we kind of study this topic. So where I'm at the moment is what was effectively the main entrance point, and here there is a nice memorial. They do recognise that there was a POW camp here, and they have a great series of information boards on the subject. So the street behind me there, where that car's just driving down conveniently, that was the camp main street, and down there to the left and right were POW huts, again very similar to those depicted in the film The Great Escape. However, clearly conditions here would have been far tougher than any Hollywood film would care to mention. Certainly by April 1945, the Germans' ability to take care of their prisoners had deteriorated past anything anybody would like to believe. And it's a real shame, because by that stage in the war, with rations being so sought after and so hard to come by, and clearly the German effort was still going toward its armed forces, the prisoners here were suffering from malnutrition, lice, and all sorts of other diseases that come with overcrowding, lack of food, unsanitary conditions, just an absolutely horrific experience. So while we may consciously picture the clearly horrific conditions at the concentration camps, and while the Germans treated the prisoners of war in a very different manner, and for reasons that we don't need to go into here, than those of the inmates at the concentration camps, the conditions in these camps was still horrendous. It was still far below the standard that, certainly as Western nations, that we would like to think prisoners would be kept in, and certainly far worse than those of German prisoners of war in Allied camps. So on the morning of the 29th, the inmates here knew something big was up. German guards started to abandon their rifles, abandon their posts, and started to clear out from the camp. So they knew something was up. They also had managed to acquire, throughout the course of the war, enough components to build radio sets so they could keep up to date with the progress of the war. So they knew that the Allied armies were advancing on their position. They heard the battle for the Amper Bridge, because where I'm stood now, it's probably less than half a mile behind those trees just there. So they could clearly hear everything that was going on. They knew that the Americans were very close to their positions. But it wasn't until midday, after the south side of the town and the Isar Bridge crossing had been dealt with, that the Americans then came to the camp here and opened the gates and liberated the prisoners of war that were here. Now, This camp, albeit it was a stalag, so not specifically designed for Allied airmen, as the film The Great Escape makes out with Stalag VIII, the camp here did house great numbers of Allied airmen. It also housed members of the Allied ground forces, Russians and other nations as well. So it was a real melting pot of the Allied and Soviet forces that were billeted here for the duration of the war. So of note here with the 100th Bomb Group, one big personality from that bomb group that almost became a prisoner here at Moosburg was Gail Cleven. Now, he had already been in captivity since 1943 when he was shot down. However, on his way here during one of the great marches from the eastern side of Germany and their initially captured territories, but that were then subsequently overrun by the Russian forces, on his way here, he managed to one night evade capture. He managed to escape the German column, and within 12 days he was back at Thorpe Abbots. So he never made it to Moosburg. He managed to get home. So 99% of the original buildings from Moosburg camp and Stalag VIIA are no longer here. It's now a residential area. Right, so a short walk from the memorial, and I'm now in the area of the only surviving buildings of Stalag VIIA that I've been able to find, at least, and they are these buildings behind me. So when General Patton visited here on the 1st of May, he came across one particular group of prisoners who looked extremely worse for wear. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. And one of those men was Frank Murphy, a former navigator who crewed B-17s with the 418th Bomb Squadron from the 100th Bomb Group out of Thorpe Abbots in England. Patton took one look at them, and in reference to the Germans and their treatment of the prisoners, he exclaimed, "I'll kill the sons of bitches for this." So to finish off the story of Moosburg and Stalag VIIA, I couldn't think of a more fitting location than here in the small hamlet of Oberreich, which is just outside of the town of Moosburg itself. So the ground that I'm currently on was designated as the first cemetery for those POWs who lost their lives whilst in captivity at Stalag VIIA. And now there are memorials here to it, and those prisoners who did lose their lives in the camp as a result of their captivity under the Third Reich will be remembered here. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of World War II Wayfinder, the tale of Moosburg, General Patton and the 100th Bomb Group. If you want to see more World War II Wayfinder content, just tap that subscribe button and that bell so you're notified of every time I release a new video. So, I will see you all in the next one.